So we're here today to talk about a bunch of new stuff that has been added to CSS over the last few years. And, for better or worse, CSS kind of gets a little bit of a bad rep in the development community. And I think a lot of the reason for that is a lot of people have allowed their CSS code bases to kind of spiral out of control and become totally unmaintainable, leading to things like having to use the important marker on an all too frequent basis to get your styles to apply. But really, CSS has done just a whole lot to kind of up its game in the last few years. So today I want to talk about a lot of the new features that have been added to it, less with an eye towards giving a deep dive into any one specific property, and more towards kind of one, letting the development and engineering team be aware of some of the new features that are out there and things that they could reach for versus either an older technique or like a JavaScript solution. And two, to give the more design oriented folks an idea of what kind of things are now possible to achieve on the web when they're putting their designs together, and like not be so kind of locked into the constraints that we used to have with the web. So really, this kind of just boils down to the fact that, actually, before we get started too much, I really want to make sure that I call out some specific people who I have learned just like an insane amount from over the time that I've been writing CSS, and I think it's really important to give them credit. So Jen Simmons has done a huge amount to advance the subject of graphic design and layout on the web. Rachel Andrew is almost single-handedly responsible for us having CSS Grid in as stable of an implementation as we do. Leah Veru has done a whole lot on the CSS working group to advance language. Una Kravitz is on the material design team at Google and has been doing a lot to showcase what is new in CSS and some of the capabilities of CSS Houdini. Miriam Suzanne was the original author of the Suzy framework, which was kind of like a SAS-based layout framework before we had Grid. And since then, she's been doing a lot of good work to advance knowledge of CSS Grid. And then Adam Argyle works on the same team as Una Kravitz and is kind of doing the same work as she is for evangelizing for CSS. So if you're interested, they're all pretty good follows on Twitter. Those are their handles. But I want to make sure that I gave credit where credit's due. And there are a few demos in this presentation that I either lifted directly from them or were heavily inspired by them. And in those situations, I'll make sure that I link to the original demo and the resources. So anyway, all of this is to say that CSS has really come a long way in a short time. So if you think back like 5 years ago, we were just getting to use Flexbox for layouts. Most people were still largely using float-based hacks for overall layouts. If you wanted to do things like smooth scrolling, you had to reach for a JavaScript solution. So in just a few short years, CSS has added enough features that we can largely eliminate the need for layout hacks, JavaScript polyfills, and it's all while providing an updated suite of tools to like really finally achieve actual graphic design and really almost any design paradigm on the web, which is really exciting. So in this presentation, I kind of want to break it down into a few separate kind of modules so we can look at like what exists in each specific space. So first up, let's talk about layout. And layout was one of these things where for a long time, we didn't really have anything. We had floats and we hacked those to make overall page layouts. But that was pretty bad because floats were designed to have an image move off to one side and a block of text and have the text flow around them. They were not designed for full page layouts, and this led to having to do crazy things like the clear fix hack, where we had to set pseudo elements in our content to make things flow the way we wanted to, and it was really just suboptimal. So in 2017, in March, something really unique happened, and every major browser vendor, from Chrome to Firefox to Safari, shipped CSS Grid. And CSS Grid is it really finally gives us a true ubiquitous, robust, multi-purpose layout engine on the web. And with CSS Grid, we can do layouts that we've never been able to do before. We can do everything from Mondrian style poster art to flexible, responsive media galleries without media queries, and really everything in between. And it dramatically simplifies layouts, and it gives us a huge suite of options to put our layouts together. And if you were to look at the CSS Grid spec in its totality, it is quite massive. There's a lot going on, but realistically speaking, you can get super far with grid with just a few basic concepts. So we have those set up here in this basic grid declaration. So what I've got here is I've got a basic photo gallery. I've got a hero image here, and then as we scroll down, we've got all our thumbnails kind of laid out. And it's hard to see, but there is a consistent gap between all of them. They all line up perfectly in a grid that we've declared. And we do this by setting display with a property of grid on the parent element. So this entire gallery here is a div with a class of gallery. So on our parent element, we are setting the display property with the value of grid, and then we set up our grid. So we can do this a lot of different ways. We can do something as simple as what I'm about to do here, which is going to probably break this layout, but we could do like 1FR, 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 and then that's going to give us 4 equal column or equal size columns for our layout. We can shorthand this into using the repeat function. So we could say repeat for 1FR, and that's going to effectively give us the same thing as we just saw. So we're repeating 4 columns, each with a size of 1FR. And the FR unit of measurement is new, and it came with CSS Grid. And it's kind of hard to really explain exactly what that means, but I think of it as being short for free space units. So if you think about the way that you've set up box model layouts before, you have your elements, you have your padding, you have your margin, you have your borders, and border box for the box model largely eliminated the need to worry about padding and borders. But still, when you have the size of the element and you have the size of your margins between those elements, and then you have the size of the parent element, you start to have to get into doing some kind of not immediately intuitive math to know how you want to size the elements within a parent element. And FR really takes out that issue for us. So basically it means give me one portion of whatever space is left after you've taken all the other space away. So if we were to say grid template columns 32 pixels 1FR, then that's going to say, okay, our first column is 32 pixels wide, and then the 1FR unit is just whatever's left. It doesn't matter how wide our parent container is. We just want all the space that's left after that. And this can change with whatever size you want to make that first column. And you can see down here we've got one column that's narrow, and then the second column is just taking up all the space that's left. So that's great when you're dealing with just the elements themselves. But when you start to separate the elements using the grid gap property, you don't have to worry about what space there is between each of those elements. So I don't have to worry about okay, I've got one column that's 64 pixels wide. I'm going to put 1 em of space between my elements. What's that second column going to be? The FR unit just gives you the free space that's left over after you have that first column at its size and the gap taken out. So that's really, really handy. So I'm going to put this original column declaration back, and let's look at what we're doing here. So again, we're using the repeat function, and we're going to repeat two different values here. So we're going to use the autofill keyword, and that's going to automatically fill up the column space with whichever of the two values fits down here in my second function call to the min-max function. So autofill means autofill this grid with a minimum size column of 200 pixels and a maximum size column of 1FR. And then what that is going to do is, as long as the container has room for columns larger than 200 pixels, you will get columns that are 1FR, and it'll just kind of automatically make as many columns as you need using the autofill keyword. And if it gets below a point where you can no longer have more than one 200 pixel column, they will go down to 200 pixels. So that way you can have a fully responsive grid just by using this property value combination and not have to have media queries, which is pretty great. So before we move past the basics of grid, let's look real quick at grid auto rows. If you have, let's say you have 4 columns and you have 16 elements on that grid. Your first element is going to take up the first column, second element is going to take up the second column, third and the third column, fourth and the fourth column, and then from there on out, all of your elements will flow down to another row and start automatically generating rows. Now, by default, those will automatically size to the tallest height of whatever piece of content goes into that automatic row. But you can specify how big you want those auto rows to be. So we're saying here, as we're automatically generating rows, make sure they're 200 pixels tall. And then finally, the grid specific thing that we have going on here is grid gap. Grid gap just says, this is the amount of space I want to have between all of my grid items on this grid. So that's 1em between the rows, 1em between the columns. And you can do this longhand if you just want to have column gaps by doing grid column gap. Similarly, you can do this with grid row gap and then only have the gaps between the rows. So that's the basics of grid. And with grid, we can do a lot of really interesting stuff. Like we can put together this, really nice image mosaic look. And this is combining both grid and a feature we're going to look at later called mixed blend mode. So support for grid is really good. All of the modern browsers support it. So we're looking at about 95% global support. And even IE supports it using a vendor prefixed version of it. And what's really cool about that is if you still have to support IE, which we don't at Second Street, you can kind of mix in the vendor prefix version that IE has with the modern grid syntax and still get a lot of the features that you're looking for with basic layout. All right, so that's grid in its basic implementation. There's a whole lot more that you can do with it. There is a free CSS grid course that kind of goes into all of the details of that by Wes Boss, and I will link that in the final slide of this deck. So next up we have the gap property for both Flexbox and grid. So here, let's just imagine that this is a masthead. We've got 3 navigation items. We've got a logo for our bike shop, and then we've got these navigation items here at the end. It's pretty common if you're laying out a list of items in a 2-dimensional space to use Flexbox for that, and indeed you would probably see that all over our application. And Flexbox is really great for that, but what if we wanted to have some space between our flex items here? Maybe we don't want all of these things flush up against each other, but we still want them to be equal sized. Well, in the past, you would have to target the flex items or the child elements on the Flexbox parent element with something like margin right 1em, and that's okay, but then we have this last flex item here that has some margin on the right, and we don't want that, so we'd have to do like nav list li last of type margin right 0, and then that would get it done. That's fine, but why use 2 lines of CSS when we could use 1? And now with the gap property, we can just within the parent flex container itself specify the gap property and give it a value. And that works exactly like grid gap that we saw back in one of the previous slides when we were talking about grid. So it gives us this gap between each of the flex items. And that's great. And now we can use this property gap for both Flexbox and grid. And if we, when we look at a couple more grid examples later, you'll see that we've switched from using grid gap to just gap. So it's really nice to now have that for Flexbox. So support on that is not bad. It's all modern versions of Chrome, and by virtue of that, Edge and other Chromium-based browsers. Firefox is shipping that as well. It's not in Safari yet, but we will see later how we can handle non-supporting browsers for just about everything that we look at today. So the support is pretty good, and I imagine that Safari is going to be picking it up relatively soon. Okay. But in grid, using gap is even better. So we have that support in Safari, we have it in Chrome, we have it in Firefox, and we have it in Edge and Opera, etc. So you can fully start using the gap property in CSS Grid today, and then look at one of our fallback solutions for the gap in Flexbox when we get to that point in the slides. All right. So that's overview of grid and gap in Flexbox. Let's look at a new addition to the grid spec called subgrid. So I teach web design at St. Louis Community College, and a couple of the projects that we have involve taking existing HTML and using only CSS to kind of achieve your design goals. And a lot of the problems that my students have had in those exercises is an expectation that ancestor elements of a grandparent grid can be placed on that grandparent's grid. And unfortunately, the grid level 1 spec only allows for direct children of a grid container to be placed on that grid. And that's been a real headache because sometimes you want your ancestor elements to line up with the same grid as an ancestor or a grandparent a little farther up the DOM tree. So subgrid is part of grid level 2, and it aims to solve that problem. So in this example here on the left-hand side, we've got a series of cards. And the cards themselves are laid out on a grid. So this card is in a grid column, this grid card is in a grid column, they're also in grid rows. But then each of these cards are themselves a grid container. So they're using grid to lay out the heading, the text, and then the call to action and the byline down here at the bottom. So in the past, we would have to kind of make do with the fact that this wouldn't necessarily, these child elements of the cards would not lay out on the same grid that the cards themselves are laid out on. And subgrid solves that. So if we look at the card wrapper itself, which is this element here, we've got our grid set up, we've got some grid template columns set up, we've got a gap to space them out, we've got some grid rows set up, and then down here on the cards themselves, you see that we have the card set up to be display grid. We've got a baseline column set up, so we've got two columns, one automatically whatever size you need, and then 1FR will take up the rest of the space. And then we've got grid template rows, base grid template rows set up. Again, automatic for whatever the content needs, 1FR for the extra amount of space, and then auto for whatever that third row content needs. But then if you look down here, we have those same properties declared again. So we've got grid template rows declared again, and we're giving that a value of subgrid. And what that means is go ahead and take up the same rows that exist on the parent grid of the card element. So that's going to be placing the elements in the rows for the card within these grid template rows. Similarly, on grid template columns, we're doing the same thing. We're saying subgrid, and we're placing those columns, placing the elements that exist within the cards themselves on the columns of the card's parent. So why do we have grid template columns and grid template rows declared twice? I mean, we all know within CSS that if we have the same property declared after the same property, that the last declaration wins based on the cascade. Well, one of the other beauties of CSS is that CSS is fault tolerant, and browsers that do not understand a certain property or a certain value will look at that value and just ignore it and move on with their day. So browsers that do not support the value of subgrid for either grid template rows or grid template columns are going to get their value for those properties from the first declaration. So we were talking about subgrid. Just to recap on subgrid, what subgrid will do is that it will allow you to set the rows and columns of a child element onto the rows and columns of the ancestors grid itself. And if a browser does not support the subgrid value for either grid template rows or grid template columns, it will fall back to the first declaration of grid template rows or grid template columns. Now, I kind of hacked this together from a demo that Miriam Suzanne did, so I'm missing a little bit in terms of what would allow me to kind of demonstrate that effectively, but the links to her tutorial are on this slide, as well as the pen that she uses to demo it. So I will share these slides later, and you can kind of come back to it if you want to check out kind of the fallback position of that. So unfortunately, subgrid is not well supported at this point. It is supported in Firefox and nowhere else. But luckily, it is kind of a nice progressive enhancement. And if we were to look at these cards and these titles, the title headers aren't perfectly lined up, well, that's not the end of the world. It's just like a nice enhancement for people who are using a browser that supports subgrid. But again, we're going to look at how we can kind of put in place some fallback options for non-supporting browsers for certain features shortly. So next up we have multi-column layout. Multi-column layout kind of gives us the ability to do the multi-column thing that we see in a lot of newspapers and things like that, where when a horizontal amount of space runs out, the text just starts flowing into the next column, and it doesn't really matter how big the browser window is. And this is really simple to implement. All we need to do is take the parent element, and we can either use the column count property and give it the amount of columns that we want, or we can use the column width property, and we can set that to whatever value we want. And then it's going to give you as many columns as it can that are whatever size you've set it up to be. We also have column gap, which will specify how far apart those columns should be. And then if you have something like a heading that you want to make sure spans all of the columns that exists within the element where you have set the columns, you can use the column span property and give it the value of all, and then it'll span all of the columns. So that's multi-column layout. It's pretty simple and pretty powerful way to give us kind of like a newspaper style text layout. And multi-column layout is pretty well supported. Like even IE 10 supports it. So if this is something that you're interested in using, you can use it now. Okay, so next up I'm going to talk about aspect ratio real quick. I know that we have all kind of been in this situation where we are looking at like an article or something on the web, and the images haven't loaded in yet, and the image load in after the text, and then your text reflows, and the paragraph you're reading jumps down so something can kind of come in and take up the space that was there. And that's really disconcerting, and it's really like a bad user experience. So browsers have started shipping the aspect ratio property to kind of deal with that. So you can, in your CSS, declare what aspect ratio you want a given piece of content to take up, and the browser will then kind of reserve that aspect ratio within your overall content and not cause that reflow once the image loads. So you can do that yourself in your CSS, or as an alternative, Firefox has started adding this into their UA style sheet, so it just kind of is there by default. So you can say in an image, an input, a video, an embed, an iframe, a marquee if you're still using that, an object tag, or a table, you can specify a width and a height attribute within the HTML tag themselves, and Firefox will reserve that space for you without you having to do anything in your CSS. Firefox has that shipped now, and Chromium is in the process of implementing that. So this is a really nice, easy, low-hanging fruit kind of way to improve the user experience, especially if we think about our content being iframed in. We could add that potentially into the parent iframe tag themselves and make the experience of our promotions loading a little bit better. So there's not really anything to demo visually for that. Just know that you can use that in your CSS, or you can put it directly on the HTML tags themselves. Okay, so right now the support is okay. There's partial support in Chromium browsers and Firefox. It is not currently supported in Safari, but again, this is an area where it will provide progressive enhancement, and users that are on a browser like Safari that don't support these, either the attributes or the aspect ratio property itself, they'll still get that kind of janky loading experience, but that's probably what they're used to anyway. Whereas those with supporting browsers will have an improved experience. So this is something that we could start using today as well. So there are really exciting things coming to layout on the web in the future that are kind of in an experimental phase right now, but I just wanted to quickly show them because it's cool to see. And one of them is masonry layout. So this is a demo in Firefox Nightly. Firefox Nightly is currently the only browser to have this enabled, and it is enabled through a feature flag. and it's just kind of a proof of concept to show like what we could do if we had masonry layout. And this is a CSS grid layout, and the grid template rows value is set to masonry. So we have this ragged edge down here at the bottom. We have this kind of Pinterest style layout for these cards up here. And if we wanted to see what the fallback for these looks like, we could go click on any of these radio buttons here. So we could look at what I'm not. Oh, okay. You know, you think you can just go willy-nilly with a bunch of different browsers, and then it blows up in your face. Okay. Can you see this? Okay. So this is the experimental masonry layout. Again, overall parent container is a CSS grid container, and then the grid template rows value is set to masonry. And we can see that we have this Pinterest style layout of the cards, and we've got these ragged edges down here at the bottom, kind of mimicking what we want from a masonry layout. And again, Firefox Nightly is the only browser that is supporting it. It is experimental, and the spec will probably change. It's just kind of cool to see what it can do. And then if it gets implemented in this fashion within browsers, we can see what various fallbacks would look like. So this is just basic CSS grid. This is using multi-column layout, which we just looked at, which is like a really good fallback. The only problem here is that you can't control the order of how each card flows into the next column. This is what a flexbox implementation would look like, using flexbox row-based layout, and then flexbox columns. So we start to kind of lose the plot down here once we run out of elements. So still all viable options, but not quite true masonry. And then just as a quick aside, you might think that all of those different fallbacks are great, and why do we even need masonry? Well, if we look at these different things that masonry would do for us in terms of layout, like these kinds of multi-width columns while still maintaining masonry, become much, much harder to do with any other layout algorithm besides masonry. So if this is something that we can get shipped into browsers, that would be super useful. Okay, so that's masonry. I may lose the share here, so let's just find out. We're going to go back to the presentation. Okay. So there's a link to this CodePen if you want to play around with it in the slides. So that's layout, and now let's look at image processing. So first up, let's talk about CSS filters. CSS filters are super, super, super cool. They, with one line of CSS, gives us the ability to manipulate any image on the web in the same kind of way that we would do with Photoshop or Sketch or design tools. So if we have an image here and we provide the filter property, we can give it any number of different values to affect the overall aesthetic of this image. So we can turn it grayscale, and then we have a black and white image. We can do things like up the contrast. We can do things like add sepia to it, so we can kind of give it like a little washed out aesthetic. There's a whole lot of different options here. We can invert the colors of this image based on where the colors line up on a color wheel. So if we do like 100%, we basically get a negative. And this is not, there is another filter called drop shadow, which is not going to be very useful to demo here. But if you had a PNG that had transparency around the outer edge, and you wanted to have a shadow that kind of conformed to that image, you can use the drop shadow filter, and the drop shadow will come off the image itself rather than around the box that contains that element. We also have hue rotate. And all of these properties are animatable, meaning that you can transition them from one value to another. You can put them in a keyframes animation. So you can do some really cool hover effects using CSS filters. One thing that you'll probably see a lot is the blur filter, where a low quality image is loaded initially for performance reasons, and then it transitions into a higher resolution image, and the blur filter is animated off of it. So that's kind of a nice little performance trick too. And if this is something that you're interested in playing with, you can open Firefox developer tools have like a really cool um, filter tool built into them. So any element that you have applied a filter to will have this little like two-tone square circle here. And if you click on that, it's going to pull up this like WYSIWYG, and you can select a filter, add it to the list of filters, apply different values. Brightness was probably a bad choice. Let's do grayscale. And then you can kind of see it start to change. Let's get rid of the blur here. Anyway, it's not as easy to tell as I would like it to be. I'm not entirely sure why you have to use these number controls instead of just being able to type it in, but c'est la vie. So using this, you could kind of put together, a list of different filters to give a certain effect, and then you can save that as a preset within Firefox and apply that to any other image that you want. So that's pretty sweet. And if you wanted to, you can reorder them by grabbing and pulling them over on top of each other, because the order that you apply your filters in will matter. And then again, you can save your presets over here and apply them if you wanted to. Another quick aside on Firefox developer tools: anytime you make a change in the browser, it saves it to this changes tab, which is in the right hand column, and you can just copy either all of the changes or a specific rule that you've changed out of here, so that you can just paste it into your CSS, which is pretty sweet. Okay, so that is CSS filters. And browser support's pretty great there. Again, we don't have IE, but who cares? Everything else is there for us. So next up is backdrop filter. And I may lose the video again because I have to change browsers, but we'll find out. Nope. Cool, still presenting. So backdrop filter is really cool because it gives us a lot of the things that we got from filter, but on the background. So here I have some text in this H1 on this element, and I've applied the backdrop filter property with a value of blur 10 pixels, just like we just saw in the previous filter demo. Whereas rather than blurring the entire element, including the text that's here, it is just blurring the background, so we can have a little bit more legibility on this H1 over this image. And we can kind of do all of the things that we were doing with filter. We can make the background black and white, we could make it sepia, etc., etc. All the same values are there for us. So this is backdrop filter, super cool. Unfortunately, if we were to look at backdrop filter, we can see it's not supported yet in Firefox, but it is behind a feature flag. So that means they are in active development. So we've got backdrop filter in all the Chromium browsers plus Safari, and Firefox is working on it. So that's pretty encouraging. All right, so next up we have mixed blend mode. And mixed blend mode is a way that you can define how the foreground content mixes with the background content. So in this image here, we've got a background image of these mountains, and then we have a foreground piece of content, which is this text that has the color set to white. And the value of mixed blend mode here is what is determining how the difference between the color of the text here and the colors that are present in this image are represented on the text itself. So there's a lot of different values that you can have here. I chose exclusion for this particular example because it kind of gives a nice effect, but there are other values like difference. which isn't too terribly different, but you can kind of see a little edge coming around here. I don't have the list handy, but this link to the MDN documentation will show all of the different things that you can do with mixed blend mode. You can really get into doing some super cool design stuff with just with mixed blend mode, but if you were to like mix this with filters and grid layout, you can really get to doing some cool things like that image mosaic I showed earlier. And also, if we start to do like text overlays here, and we want to have the text that's overlaying an image have a certain aesthetic to it, mixed blend mode will give us this as well. So browser support is pretty much there on mixed blend mode, so let your design sensibilities run wild with that. Okay. We also now have the ability to clip images on the web. Previously, we had to do this like crazy nonsense with absolute positioning of a bunch of different divs around an image if we wanted to give a specific shape. But now we can just use the clip path property. And clip path will take a number of different values. It'll take polygon, which you can specify any kind of custom polygon that you want. It will take circle. It will take ellipse. There's a lot to work with there. And it too is a property that can be animated. So here I'm using a combination of clip path to change this image into a circle. And then I'm using a property of shape outside to specify how I want the text to flow around that image. And if we change this, we can see that this gets clipped here into a diamond. This text lays out a little bit better, not in this live preview, but you kind of get the point. So you can do a lot of different cool layout stuff with a combination of clip path and shape outside. I should mention that clip path is an animatable property. You can transition it and you can put it in a keyframes animation. But in order to do that, you need to have the exact same number of points within your polygon. You can't go from a 3-stop polygon to a 4-stop polygon and have that animate seamlessly. So just keep that in mind if that's something that you want to animate. So I mentioned it before we go on. Clip path is pretty well supported. Again, we've got partial support in Edge and Chrome and Safari. Firefox is fully there. If you're interested in finding out what Edge and Chrome is lacking, this is a live embed, so you can link to this. But still, it's the support that Chromium-based browsers have is pretty robust. So working in tandem with clip path is shape outside. Shape outside is a way for you to declare basically how the adjoining content should flow around a given piece of content or HTML element. So we can do these slanted layouts here. We can do circular layouts. There's a lot of really cool stuff on one of these resources that I have linked at the last slide, where you can really just like mimic the overall shape of like grapes, for example. It really just kind of ups our game in terms of overall layout and typography. We don't have to rely anymore on just having 90-degree angles when we're looking at how our text is going to flow. So shape outside, super well supported. Go ahead and use it. All right, let's look at object fit. So we're all probably used to the background size property when we're looking at background images. If we wanted to use the value of cover, we can say to the browser background size cover, and it will take a background image, it will cover a given piece of content, and it will just kind of crop that background image willy-nilly. You can position it, but it's going to make sure that it covers the element. That's great for background images, but it doesn't work for foreground images, like actual image tags that exist within our HTML. And object fit gives us just that ability with content images. So each one of these different images in this layout here is the same image, and all of them have the object fit property set to cover. So it's making sure that that image tag is covering up the element that it lives in. It's not sizing down to make sure the whole image is in place. It's not distorting the size of the parent element that it's in. Using the object fit cover with a fixed height makes it so that entire parent element is covered with that image. Similarly to object fit cover, you can use the contain keyword, and that will work just like background size contain. It will make sure that you see all of the image that exists within the parent element. And then if the positioning of your image is not to your liking, you can also use the object position property, and that works just like background position. So we can use this in all modern browsers. It does not exist in IE. Again, that's totally fine, but it's been supported pretty well across modern browsers for quite a long time, so safe to use there. Okay, so let's go through a little bit of typography here. First up is CSS writing modes. So CSS writing modes is it exists kind of in two spaces, if you want to think about it. It exists in a design standpoint, so this is a nice kind of like visual vertical text here, but it also exists for internationalization, because Eurocentric languages are they're all read left to right. So our standard kind of writing model of laying out our text from left to right is fine, but we get into vertical languages like Mandarin, or right to left languages like I want to say Arabic. The standard layout kind of breaks down. So writing modes gives us a solution to that for different languages and also for kind of an additional design element. So if we were to like go back to this labs.jensimmons.com, we can look at this layout that she has on her homepage, and we can see examples of writing modes being applied here. So rather than just taking an element and transforming it with a rotate, this actually gives us a fully vertical text. You might notice here that my cursor is horizontal to accommodate for that writing mode, and that's because we are using writing mode there. So the text for that is just this. So we use the writing mode property, and we can give it a value of horizontal-RL, horizontal-LR, vertical-RL, and vertical-LR, and then it'll kind of take care of that for us. So that's cool, but what if we wanted to get into using things like margins and padding and things like that? So you might think, okay, this text is rotated. I want to get a little bit more margin on the bottom of it and kind of space that pink bar away from it. So I'll say margin bottom. We'll just do something like crazy for effect. Well, nothing has changed. Like it's not spacing. It's not giving me any more space here on what appears to be the bottom of the text based on how the text would read. So let's look at what if we did like margin top. Well, that's not ideal. What if we had like our entire layout set up using margins and padding and things like that, and then we wanted to translate it into a different language that was not a left to right language, then our entire layout would start to fall apart. So we need something to deal with that, and we'll come to that in just a second. But first, browser support for writing mode, super good. So the problem that I just described, where everything is based around Eurocentric languages of margin, padding, left, right, top, bottom, and those breaking down when we start to get into non-Eurocentric languages, is solved by a new concept called logical properties. And logical properties takes the concept of margin left, margin right, margin top, margin bottom, and changes it into a new paradigm. And this is kind of what that looks like. So in this demo, if we look at this, we've got the H2 in the paragraph, and we're setting a new property here called margin inline start. And this is equivalent to margin left. So if I add margin left there, you see nothing changes. So let's put it back to inline start. And then margin block start is equivalent to margin top. We change that, we'll see nothing changes. So if you think about margin block as margin top, and margin block start as margin top, margin block end as margin bottom, and then margin inline start and margin inline end as the equivalent of margin left and margin right, then we can start to use writing modes, and the margin that we have set up for our overall layout will just kind of work for us. So if we were to add writing mode to this, let's do the same writing mode, vertical RL, and then we have vertical, all of the layout stays exactly legible, exactly the way that we want it. Nothing breaks down because we were relying on margin start and margin left and margin right. So start to think about using margin inline and margin block in place of margin left right and margin top bottom respectively. And the same goes for borders, same goes for padding, anything that involves the box model. So browser support on this is pretty good. We've got pretty wide coverage across all modern browsers. All right, so I'm going to kind of try to speed through some of the last of these because I know we're running low on time. So let's look at fluid type. It's a pretty common practice to have different media queries that set the font size of your text based on a given device. So you might have, like, say 18 pixels for desktop, 16 pixels for mobile, et cetera, et cetera. A more common practice in recent times is to kind of base your font size off viewport units, so it kind of sizes fluidly as your screen comes up and down. Now previously we had to do this like really gnarly thing where we set a base font size, and then in a media query we run this like crazy calculation to set the font size so that it scales up and down with the viewport width, and you can kind of see that happening a little bit as I size my browser down. And then once we get above a certain size, we set another static font size there. Well, we don't have to do that anymore. We now have a much more sensible option using these new values of min, max, and clamp within our CSS. So effectively, we can set the font size value to be the min function, and we're going to say whatever the minimum size is between these two. It's either going to be 1.125M or 6 VW units. Give me the minimum of that and set that to be the font size, and we still have nice fluid typography. Now that's fine, but your screen could get small enough that 6 VWs is going to be smaller than 1.125M, and things are going to get kind of like not readable. So we also have max, and that operates under the same concept. It's just opposite. You can see it scale there as well. Again, that kind of gets to a point where 6 VWs is going to be really, really big if you have like a 36-inch monitor or something like that. Well, now we have the clamp function, and the clamp function works exactly like that big gnarly piece of calc that I showed you earlier, where we provide 3 values. We're going to give a minimum value, the flexible value that we want, and then we're going to stop it at a maximum value. So it's going to clamp it between 1.125M, 1.5M, and then anything between those, it's just going to be 6 VW and be nice and fluid for us. So again, we have that. Things stay a little bit more legible when we get smaller, and we still get that nice fluid flexibility with viewport units. Browser support is good here. It's certainly something that we could employ across the board and help across a bunch of different devices. I want to show you initial letter because there are some cool typographic options here. Initial letter gives the ability to do a drop cap, or depending on how we write the syntax, a top cap, or if we really want to get crazy with some design, we can do like a block cap, something like this. So this is like using straight up CSS. We're using the first letter pseudo selector, and then we're using the initial letter, in this case vendor prefix property, to set how we want that initial letter to be styled. So here we're saying we want it to take up 3 lines. We want it to have a background of dark gray. We want to give it some padding, so we got the nice block around it. So you can really do whatever you want with this. Unfortunately, initial letter is only supported in Safari and only supported in a vendor prefix manner. but we'll look at how to deal with that. Last thing on typography, or second to last thing, is background clip. This is another thing that just exists in Safari at the moment. We can take text and we can kind of cut out the text so we can see an image beneath it. So here we've got the text. We've applied this WebKit background clip property with a value of text. And it's got the background of this GIF behind it. And you can see that behind the text, which is kind of cool. Browser this was something I put together for my old job. I did say GIF. I say GIF. I really do it to be annoying. I recognize that it stands for graphical, but I don't care. Okay, so that's a GIF. Background image options, there's a lot of different ones there. Some of these look familiar, obviously, background origin and background size. But I highlighted this down here. So Firefox, Chrome, and Safari all support the unofficial WebKit background clip, which is what I just showed you. So it's only with that vendor prefix now. So if you want to use it, you can, but you need to use the vendor prefix. And if you wanted to use it on a button, Safari will not support that. All right, last up on typography is variable fonts. I'm just going to be real quick here because there's a couple more things I'm going to show you before we run out of time. This here is one single font. Rather than having to load up a bunch of different font families to get this effect, one single font file is handling all of this, and various properties on that font are changing and being animated with a keyframe. And we can kind of see that in a little bit more detail here. So if we change some of these axes, is what they're called with variable fonts, we're able to see some of the changes and the design adjustments that we can make with one single font file and all of this different control. We don't have to load up like the compressed version, the italic version, the bold version to get all of this. Variable fonts are super, super cool, and they give us a lot of typographic freedom without the performance hit that comes with loading up a bunch of different web fonts. So that's typography. Variable fonts are pretty well supported, and they exist within design programs too, so you can use them in Adobe Creative Cloud programs. We also have new text decoration styles, so we can do wavy, double, dotted, and dashed if you're interested in styling your links a little differently. Going to blaze through these. We've got some UX enhancements. We've got position sticky. So if we had a list like this and we wanted to scroll and have that header stick to the top, we can do that with position sticky. If we wanted to kind of mix that up a little bit, so the second heading kind of bumps that next one out of the way before it sticks to the top, we can do that by changing some of the values that we give it. And if we wanted to do something like this, using a combination of inline flex and grid, we can have these cool labels for each part of our list that stick to the top. And that's all using CSS. There's no JavaScript going on there. Support's pretty good here. There are some caveats with Chromium browsers, but generally the support is way better than it was a year ago. Next, we have scroll snap. This is the kind of thing that you would have seen a JavaScript polyfill in the past where we want to have like smooth scrolling from one thing to another. So if I scroll here horizontally, it smoothly scrolls into place to each stop and lands right on the item. And this is all with CSS. This is not being done with JavaScript. Support here is okay. We've got certain properties like scroll snap align that is supported ubiquitously, and then scroll snap stop that is supported in Chromium but not yet in Firefox or Safari. So just kind of play around with it and look at what your fallbacks are. Okay, custom properties. Custom properties are a way to set default values like variables in Sass that you can then reference wherever you want, and you can set them within you don't have to declare them at the top of your file. You can set them within a container. And the way that they are different than Sass variables is that they are live variables. So you can update them dynamically, whereas Sass variables just compile out to a specific value. So if I were to toggle this dark mode class onto this element here, which switches the value of color primary and color secondary, I can change that back and forth. And another way in which they are different than Sass variables is that they are part of the cascade. So I have, I'm selecting the H1 here. So if I wanted to say color primary is pink, then you can see that this value, because of the cascade, is overriding the color value, color primary value that is set on the parent container. Similarly to just being able to toggle a class on and off, we could reference these in a new media query called @media prefers color scheme dark. So if we were to do the same thing here, we're going to toggle off our dark mode, so we'll remove that class, and then I'll change the values of those variables within this media query. I have dark mode set on my system preferences, so this media query respects your system preferences. So you can update those values here. So again, in your elements, you can set your color to those variable values, and then you can change those variable values based on certain conditions. Those are pretty widely supported, and indeed we use them in a lot of our platforms. Last thing we're going to talk about today is new selectors. I'm going to bang this out as fast as possible. I know we're slightly over, so I apologize. We have the is pseudo selector. So if we have the is pseudo selector, and in parentheses we select header, main, footer, and then we have p hover, that is the equivalent to saying header p colon hover, main p colon hover, etc. So it kind of cleans that up a bit, and this is not that dramatic. But if you look at like this big block of insanity, where you're selecting every single H1 that is nested either one level deep or 2 levels deep, you can dramatically clean that up with the is pseudo selector. So this is the exact same equivalent of the previous slide, where we're using every option that we have for the first level, every option that we have for the second level, and then an H1 nested that level deep. Really cleans that bit up a bit. Then we have focus within. We all know about focus, a specific element being focused. Focus within gives us the ability to target an element further up the DOM than the element that's being focused. So if I wanted to do something with the form, if any of these inputs gets focused, like change the background or the color, we can do that by using the focus in pseudo selector. So I focus on the input and it gets those updated styles. That's cool for forms, but it's really cool for like sub-level menus. So if we have like a drop down here, and I want to make sure that this this nav item gets a certain color, if I click on one of its sub nav items, I can use focus within to do that. So I've got focus on the sub level, and that is applying the style to this guy. So all this is super, super, super cool, I think. CSS is great and has added a lot of really cool stuff. But, you know, we've looked at a lot of support charts, and some of them were really good, but some of them had a lot of red on them. So, like, what about the browsers? Like, what do we do to make sure that we can take care of browsers that don't support all this cool stuff? Well, we have two ways to handle that. First of all, we can ask the question, does every website need to look the same? The answer to that is no. So in those situations, we can use what we saw with a cascade, where we can use new values where supported, and then have a backup kind of preceding them in the CSS declaration for non-supporting browsers. And that works great if we think back to our subgrid demos. But we also have this new media query. And this new media query is @supports. And it's actually called a feature query. So this can be used for really any CSS property. Here, I'm using it for that initial letter property that we saw when we did the drop cap. So we're saying, okay, if the browser supports either initial letter property with a value of 4 or WebKit initial letter value with a property of 4, then we want to apply all of these things. So we're doing the stuff where we get that drop cap, and we're going to go ahead and add in the font weight and the margin right here, because all browsers understand font weight and margin right, but not all browsers understand initial letter. So if those browsers pick up font weight and margin right, but not the initial letter where it gives you like that increased height, then you're just going to have a bold first letter with like some extra margin to the right of it, and that'll look really weird. @supports solves that problem for you. It looks at whether or not the browser supports these things, and if it doesn't, it just moves on. So you can do display grid in here, you could do grid template column subgrid, really anything that you want to check for. The @supports media query or feature query, I'm sorry, will take care of you there. And finally, if you're checking this out later, here's a lot of really good resources that I got a lot of this stuff from. There's conference talks. There are YouTube channels and YouTube tutorials. So those are all really great. I had at one point planned to talk about CSS Houdini in this, and after I started going through that, it became clear that that was not going to be possible. So I will give a lunch and learn on CSS Houdini in the future. But it's a good thing I didn't try since this already went over. But that's it. That's what's new in CSS. If people don't have to run off right away, I can take some questions. Otherwise, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.